Good afternoon and a happy Wednesday to you. I'm slightly distracted because we've got some of the children in this class making a lovely picture against one of our windows. It looks quite nice to look at in the sunshine. We got to in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Harry was a little bit worried about Professor Snape and how he might behave in the Quidditch game that Snape was refereeing, and also beginning to think that Snape could read his mind. Surely no one can read minds, even in the wizarding world. Also, they're still trying to find out what might be hidden underneath Fluffy, the three-headed dog, and they just found out who Nicholas Flamel was and that he held something called the Philosopher's Stone, which meant you could make as much gold as you wanted and live forever. Let's get on and see what happens next. Harry knew, when they wished him good luck outside the changing rooms next afternoon, that Ron and Hermione were wondering whether they'd ever see him alive again. This wasn't what you'd call comforting. Harry hardly heard a word of Wood's pet talk as he pulled on his Quidditch robes and picked up his Nimbus 2000. Ron and Hermione, meanwhile, had found a place in the stands next to Neville, who couldn't understand why they looked so grim and worried, or why they had both brought their wands to the match. Little did Harry know that Ron and Hermione had been secretly practicing the leg locker curse. They'd got the idea from Malfoy using it on Neville and were ready to use it on Snape if he showed any sign of wanting to hurt Harry. Now, don't forget, it's locomotor mortis, Hermione muttered as Ron wiped his wand up his sleeve. I know, Ron snapped. Don't nag. Back in the changing room, Wood had taken Harry aside. I don't want to pressure you, Potter, but if we ever need an early catch of the snitch, it's now. Finish the game before Snape can favour Hufflepuff too much. The whole school's out there, said Fred Weasley, peering out the door. Even, blimey, Dumbledore's come to watch. Harry's heart did a somersault. Dumbledore, he said, dashing to the door to make sure. Fred was right. There was no mistaking that silver beard. Harry could have laughed out loud with relief. He was safe. There was simply no way that Snape would dare to try and hurt him if Dumbledore was watching. Perhaps that's why Snape was looking so angry as the teams marched onto the pitch, something that Ron noticed too. I've never seen Snape look so mean, he told Hermione. Look, they're off. Ouch! Someone had poked Ron in the back of the head. It was Malfoy. Oh, sorry, Weasley, didn't see you there. Malfoy grinned broadly at Crabbe and Goyle. Wonder how long Potter's going to stay on his broom this time. Anyone want a bet? What about you, Weasley? Ron didn't answer. Snape had just awarded Hufflepuff a penalty because George Weasley had hit a bludger at him. Hermione, who had all her fingers crossed in her lap, was squinting fixedly at Harry, who was circling the game like a hawk looking for the snitch. You know, how I think they choose people for the Gryffindor team, said Malfoy loudly a few minutes later as Snape awarded Hufflepuff another penalty for no reason at all. It's people they feel sorry for. See, there's Potter, who has no parents. Then there's the Weasleys, who've got no money. You should be on the team, Longbottom. You've got no brains. Neville went bright red, but turned in his seat to face Malfoy. I'm worth 12 of you, Malfoy, he stammered. Malfoy, Crabbe and Goyle howled with laughter. But Ron, still not daring to take his eyes from the game, said, Yeah, you tell him, Neville. Longbottom, if brains were gold, you'd be poorer than Weasley, and that's saying something. Ron's nerves are already stretched to breaking point with anxiety about Harry. I'm warning you, Malfoy. One more word. Ron, said Hermione suddenly. Harry. What? Where? Harry had suddenly gone into a spectacular dive, which drew gasps and cheers from the crowd. Hermione stood up, her crossed fingers in her mouth as Harry streaked towards the ground like a bullet. You're in luck, Weasley. Potter's obviously spotted some money on the ground, said Malfoy. Ron snapped. Before Malfoy knew what was happening, Ron was on top of him, wrestling him to the ground. Neville hesitated, then clambered over the back of his seat to help. Come on, Harry, Hermione screamed, leaping onto her seat to watch as Harry sped straight at Snape. She didn't even notice Malfoy and Ron rolling under her seat, or the scuffles and yelps coming from the whirl of fists that was Neville, Crabbe and Goyle. Up in the air, Snape turned on his broomstick just in time to see something scarlet shoot past him, missing him by inches. Next second, Harry had pulled out of the dive, his arm raised in triumph, the snitch clasped in his hand. The stands erupted. It had to be a record. No one could ever remember the snitch being caught so quickly. Ron, where are you? The game's over. Harry's won. We've won. Gryffindor in the lead, shrieked Hermione, dancing up and down on her seat and hugging Parvati Patil in the row in front. Harry jumped off his broom, a foot from the ground. He couldn't believe it. He'd done it. The game was over. It had barely lasted 5 minutes. As Gryffindors came spilling onto the pitch, he saw Snape land nearby, white-faced and tight-lipped. Then Harry felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up into Dumbledore's smiling face. Well done, said Dumbledore quietly, so that only Harry could hear. Nice to see you haven't been brooding about that mirror. Been keeping busy. Excellent. Snape spat bitterly on the ground. Harry left the changing room alone sometime later to take his Nimbus 2000 back to the broom shed. He couldn't ever remember feeling happier. He'd really done something to be proud of now. No one could say he was just a famous name anymore. The evening air had never smelled so sweet. He walked over the damp grass, reliving the last hour in his head, which was a happy blur. Gryffindors running to lift him onto their shoulders, Ron and Hermione in the distance jumping up and down, Ron cheering through a heavy nosebleed. Harry had reached the shed. He leant against the wooden door and looked up at Hogwarts, with its windows glowing red in the setting sun. Gryffindor in the lead. He'd done it. He'd shown Snape. And speaking of Snape, a hooded figure came swiftly down the front steps of the castle. Clearly not wanting to be seen, it walked as fast as possible towards the forbidden forest. Harry's victory faded from his mind as he watched. He recognised the figure's prowling walk. Snape, sneaking into the forest while everyone else was at dinner. What was going on? Harry jumped back on his Nimbus 2000 and took off. Gliding silently over the castle, he saw Snape enter the forest at a run. He followed. The trees were so thick he couldn't see where Snape had gone. He flew in circles, lower and lower, brushing the top branches of trees until he heard voices. He glided towards them and landed noiselessly in a towering beech tree. He climbed carefully along one of the branches, holding tight to his broomstick, trying to see through the leaves. Below, in a shadowy clearing, stood Snape, but he wasn't alone. Quirrell was there too. Harry couldn't make out the look on his face, but he was stuttering worse than ever. Harry strained to catch what they were saying. Don't know why you wanted to meet here, all of places, Severus. Oh, I thought we'd keep this private, said Snape. Students aren't supposed to know about the Philosopher's Stone, after all. Harry leant forward. Quirrell was mumbling something. Snape interrupted him. Have you found out how to get past that beast of Hagrid's yet? But Severus, You don't want me as your enemy, Quirrell, said Snape, taking a step towards him. I don't know what you mean. You know perfectly well what I mean. An owl hooted loudly, and Harry nearly fell out of the tree. He steadied himself in time to hear Snape say, Your little bit of hocus pocus? I'm waiting. But I don't. Very well, Snape cut in. We'll have another chat soon, when you've had time to think things over and decided where your loyalties lie. He threw his cloak over his head and strode out of the clearing. It was almost dark now, but Harry could see Quirrell standing quite still as though he was petrified. Harry, where have you been? Hermione squeaked. We won! You won! We won! Shouted Ron, thumping Harry on the back. And I gave Malfoy a black eye, and Neville tried to take on Crabbe and Goyle single-handed. He's still out cold, but Madame Pomfrey says he'll be all right. Talk about showing Slytherin. Everyone's waiting for you in the common room. We're having a party. Fred and George stole some cakes and stuff from the kitchens. Never mind that now. Let's find an empty room. You wait till you hear this. He made sure Peeves wasn't inside before shutting the door behind them, and then he told them what he'd seen and heard. So, we were right. It is the Philosopher's Stone, and Snape's trying to force Quirrell to get it. He asked if he knew about how to get past Fluffy, and he said something about Quirrell's hocus pocus. I reckon there are other things guarding the stone apart from Fluffy. Loads of enchantments, probably, and Quirrell would have done some anti-dark art spell which Snape needs to break through. So, you mean the stone's only as safe as long as Quirrell stands up to Snape, said Hermione in alarm. He'll be gone by next Tuesday, said Ron. Chapter 14. Norbert, the Norwegian Ridgeback. Quirrell, however, must have been braver than they thought. In the weeks that followed, he did seem to be getting paler and thinner, but he didn't look as though he'd cracked yet. Every time they passed the third-floor corridor, Harry, Ron and Hermione would press their ears to the door to check that Fluffy was still growling inside. Snape was sweeping about in his usual bad temper, which surely meant that the stone was still safe. Whenever Harry passed Quirrell these days, he gave him an encouraging sort of smile, and Ron had started telling people off for laughing at Quirrell's stutter. Hermione, however, had more on her mind than the Philosopher's Stone. She had started drawing up revision timetables and colour-coding all her notes. Harry and Ron wouldn't have minded, but she kept nagging them to do the same. Hermione, the exams are ages away. 10 weeks. That's not ages. That's like a second to Nicholas Flamel. Yeah, but we're not 600 years old, Ron reminded her. Anyway, what are you revising for? You already know it all. What am I revising for? Are you mad? You realise we need to pass these exams to get into the second year? They're very important. I should have started studying a month ago. I don't know what's gotten into me. Unfortunately, the teachers seemed to be thinking along the same lines as Hermione. They piled so much homework on them that the Easter holidays weren't nearly as much fun as the Christmas ones. It was hard to relax with Hermione next to you, reciting the 12 uses of dragon's blood or practicing wand movements. Moaning and yawning, Harry and Ron spent most of their free time in the library with her, trying to get through all their extra work. I'll never remember this, Ron burst out one afternoon, throwing down his quill and looking longingly out of the library window. It was the first really fine day they'd had in months. The sky was a clear forget-me-not blue, and there was a feeling in the air of summer coming. Harry, who was looking up at Dittany in 1,000 magical herbs and fungi, didn't look up until he heard Ron say, "Hagrid, what are you doing in the library?" Hagrid shuffled into view, hiding something behind his back. He looked very out of place in his moleskin overcoat. "I'm just looking," he said in a shifty voice that got the interest at once. "And what are you lot up to?" He looked suddenly suspicious. "You're not still looking for Nicholas Flamel, are you?" "Oh, we found out who he was ages ago," said Ron impressively. "And we know what that dog's guarding. It's a philosopher's..." Shh. Hagrid looked around quickly to see if anyone was listening. "Don't go shouting about it. What's the matter with you?" "There are a few things we wanted to ask you, as a matter of fact," said Harry. "About what's guarding the stone apart from Fluffy." "Shh," said Hagrid again. "Listen, come and see me later. I'm not promising I'll tell you anything, mind, but don't go rabbing about it here. Students aren't supposed to know. They'll think I've told you." "See you later then," said Harry. Hagrid shuffled off. "What was he hiding behind his back?" said Hermione thoughtfully. "Do you think it's got anything to do with the stone?" "Oh, I'm going to go and see what section he was in," said Ron, who had enough of working. He came back a minute later with a pile of books in his arms and slammed them down on the table. "Dragons," he whispered. Hagrid was looking up stuff about dragons. "Look at these. Dragon species of Great Britain and Ireland, from egg to inferno, a dragon keeper's guide." "Hagrid's always wanted a dragon. He told me so the first time I ever met him," said Harry. "It's against our laws," said Ron. "Dragon breeding was outlawed by the Warlocks Convention of 1709. Everyone knows that. It's hard to stop muggles noticing us if we're keeping dragons in the back garden. Anyway, you can't tame dragons. It's dangerous. You should see the burns Charlie's got off wild ones in Romania." "But there aren't wild dragons in Britain," said Harry. "Of course there are," said Ron. "Commonwealth's green and Hebridean blacks. The Ministry of Magic has a job hushing them up, I can tell you. Our lot have to keep putting spells on muggles who've spotted them to make them forget." "So, what on earth's Hagrid up to?" said Hermione. When they knocked on the door of the gamekeeper's hut an hour later, they were surprised to see that all the curtains were closed. Hagrid called, "Who is it?" before he let them in and then shut the door quickly behind them. It was stiflingly hot inside. Even though it was such a warm day, there was a blazing fire in the grate. Hagrid made them tea and offered them stoked sandwiches, which they refused. "So, you wanted to ask me something?" "Yeah," said Harry. There's no point beating about the bush. "We were wondering if you could tell us what's guarding the Philosopher's Stone apart from Fluffy." Hagrid frowned at him. "Of course I can't. Number one, I don't know myself. Number two, you know too much already, so I wouldn't tell you if I could. The stone's there for a good reason. It was almost stolen out of Gringotts. I suppose you've worked that out and all. Beats me, I even know about Fluffy. Oh, come on, Hagrid. You might not want to tell us, but you do know. You know everything that goes on around here, said Hermione in a warm voice. Hagrid's beard twitched. They could tell he was smiling. We only wondered who had done the guarding, really, Hermione went on. We wondered who Dumbledore had trusted enough to help him, apart from you. Hagrid's chest swelled at these last words. Harry and Ron beamed at Hermione. Well, I don't suppose it'd hurt to tell you. Let's see. He borrowed Fluffy from me. Then some of the teachers had put enchantments on it. Professor Sprout, Professor Flitwick, Professor McGonagall. He ticked them off on his fingers. Professor Quirrell, and Dumbledore himself did something, of course. Hang on, I've forgotten someone. Oh, yeah. Professor Snape. Snape? Yeah. You're not still going on about that, are you? Look, Snape helped protect the stone. He's not about to steal it. Harry knew Ron and Hermione were thinking the same as he was. If Snape had been in on protecting the stone, it must have been easy to find out how the other teachers had guarded it. He probably knew everything, except, it seemed, Quirrell's spell and how to get past Fluffy. You're the only one who knows how to get past Fluffy, aren't you, Hagrid? Said Harry anxiously. And you wouldn't tell anyone, would you? Not even one of the teachers? Not a soul knows except me and Dumbledore, said Hagrid proudly. Well, that's something, Harry muttered to the others. Hagrid, can we have a window open? I'm boiling. I can't, Harry. Sorry. Harry noted and glanced at the fire. Harry looked at it too. Hagrid, what's that? But he already knew what it was. In the very heart of the fire, underneath the kettle, was a huge black egg. That's... Where did you get it, Hagrid? Said Ron, crouching over the fire to get a closer look at the egg. It must have cost you a fortune. Oh, I won it. Last night, I was down in the village having a few drinks and I got in a game of cards with a stranger. I think he was quite glad to get rid of it, to be honest. But what are you going to do with it when it's hatched? Said Hermione. Well, I've been doing some reading, said Hagrid, pulling a large book from under his pillow. Got this out of the library. Dragon breeding for pleasure and profit. It's a bit out of date, of course, but it's all in there. Keep the egg in the fire, because their mothers breathe on them, see? And when it hatches, feed them on a bucket of brandy mixed with chicken blood every half hour. See in here, how to recognise different eggs. What he got there is a Norwegian ridgeback. They're rare, then. He looked very pleased with himself, but Hermione didn't. Hagrid, you live in a wooden house, she said. But Hagrid wasn't listening. He was humming merrily as he stoked the fire. So now they had something else to worry about. What might happen to Hagrid if anyone found out he was hiding an illegal dragon in his hut? Wonder what it's like to have a peaceful life, Ron sighed, as evening after evening they struggled through all the extra homework they were getting. Hermione had now started making revision timetables for Harry and Ron too. It was driving them mad. Then, one breakfast time, Hedwig brought Harry another note from Hagrid. It had written only 2 words. It's hatching. Ron wanted to skip herbology to go straight down to the hut. Hermione wouldn't hear of it. Oh, Hermione, how many times in our lives are we going to see a dragon hatching? We've got lessons. We'll get into trouble. And that's nothing to what Hagrid's going to be. And when someone finds out what he's doing... Shut up, Harry whispered. Malfoy was only a few feet away, and he had stopped dead to listen. How much had he heard? Harry didn't like the look on Malfoy's face at all. Ron and Hermione argued all the way to herbology, and in the end, Hermione agreed to run down to Hagrid's with the other two during morning break. When the bell sounded from the castle at the end of their lesson, the 3 of them dropped their trowels at once and hurried through the grounds to the edge of the forest. Hagrid greeted them, looking flushed and excited. It's nearly out. He looked and ushered them inside. The egg was lying on the table. There were deep cracks in it, and something was moving inside. A funny clicking noise was coming from it. They all drew their chairs up to the table and watched with bated breath. All at once there was a scraping noise and the egg split open. The baby dragon flopped onto the table. It wasn't exactly pretty. Harry thought it looked like a crumpled black umbrella. Its spiny wings were huge compared to its skinny jet black body, and it had a long snout with wide nostrils, stubs of horns and bulging orange eyes. It sneezed. A couple of sparks flew out of its snout. Oh, isn't he beautiful? Hagrid murmured. He reached out a hand to stroke the dragon's head. It snapped at his fingers, showing pointed fangs. "Oh, bless him. Look, he knows his mummy," said Hagrid. "Hagrid," said Hermione, "how fast do Norwegian ridgebacks grow exactly?" Hagrid was about to answer when the colour suddenly drained from his face. He leapt to his feet and ran to the window. "What's the matter?" "Oh my God, someone was looking through the gap in the curtains. It's a kid, he's running back up to school." Harry bolted to the door and looked out. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking him. Malfoy had seen the dragon. We shall leave it there for today and see if anything comes of Malfoy finding out about Hagrid having a dragon, and also whether Snape manages to get by Fluffy and find the Philosopher's Stone. Have a very nice Wednesday afternoon. Toodle pip.